My name is Nathan. This is the first negative constructive. In American government, kings are being disguised as presidents. The American Enterprise Institute explains presidents lead through executive actions, which carry the full force of law, outnumbering actual laws every year. But because they're not passed through Congress, they're unstable. One president signs an order, the next repeals it, then another brings it back in a more extreme form, and the cycle keeps going. Indeed, half of Biden's first 50 actions were reversals of Trump's. And within hours of taking office, ABC reports Trump rescinded 91 of Biden's orders, the most in history. Scarily, no one is stopping them. Howell, dean of Johns Hopkins School of Government, found when orders are challenged in court, the president wins 83% of the time. In Congress, they rarely lift a finger. Out of all executive orders, they've only even responded to 3%. And not a single bill trying to limit one has ever made it out of committee. Thus, because orders are simply a tool of unlimited abuse, Adonai and I are proud to negate. This tool causes two major harms. The first is policy whiplash. Endless orders have thrown the public into chaos. Rosen last year finds businesses, hospitals, and local governments just can't plan budgets or train staff when rules keep changing. These swings have cost $1.7 trillion in losses, which is the entire economy of Spain, for instance. And nowhere is this worse than climate. Dr. Podesta, the Center for American Progress, warned in 2020 that flip-flopping climate rules makes it impossible for the U.S. to lead international progress. The Treasury of Colombia quantifies the damage over 30 years. Flip-flopping policies like joining and leading the Paris Agreement slash research spending by 10% and clean energy patents by 2% annually. Disastrously, the University of Liverpool found last year that climate change is already raising sea levels in Asia and drying out farmland in Africa, forcing 900 million people to migrate, increasing conflict over food and water. Then, the second consequence is populism. Executive orders divide the people. The Democratic Erosion Consortium in 22 explains when each president undoes the last one's orders, it immediately highlights their most severe differences. This gives moderates an immediate reason to dislike the new president, fueling an us versus them mentality that creates more blame and less understanding. Dr. Bergen of Time warns that president's promises that I alone can fix it feeds a public craving for immediate action. Thus, candidates don't even pretend they'll work with Congress anymore, making people falsely believe that Congress is an ineffective body. Rachel Kleinfeld at the Carnegie Endowment warned this degradation of checks and balances opens the door to dangerous populism. And Dr. White of U of Florida found last year that populism oversimplifies complex problems into emotional slogans, politicizing everything and destroying compromise on all future crises. Dr. Lee of Harvard warns populists to raid institutions, destroy collaboration, and ignore long-term threats for short-term appeasement. Thus, Rosen last year finds extreme orders have torn apart departments for health, treasury, security, environmental, and more. For instance, Reuters last month finds Trump used an order to cut 2,000 staff members from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and force 50% of all responsibility onto states. That's devastating, since FEMA has been crucial for responding to 639 fires, floods, and storms since 2020. Overall, Dr. Lee warns that this dogmatic policymaking puts us at risk with all crises, like the next virus, climate change, and all future conflicts. Thus, to bring both sides of the aisle back to a democracy, we are proud to begin.
Judges and opponents ready? Reaffirm. Americans today are feeling increasingly abandoned by their representatives. At the Pew Research Center found in 2023 that 72% of Americans believe Congress no longer represents the people, the highest rate in nearly 4 decades. Unfortunately, decades of conflicting interests have polarized our nation's Congress. As Dan Balls, chief correspondent of the Washington Post, confirmed in 2023 that the growing urban-rural divide, geographic sorting, and party ideology have made seeking common ground difficult. However, not all hope is lost. as executive orders, directives led by the president emerged as a solution to our broken legislative system. William Howell of UChicago cooperated in 2016 that with presidents strongly motivated by their legacies, they're compelled to craft effective representative policy, which is why a 64-year study by Rogalski of UChicago finds that executive orders generally align with public opinion, serving as a clear reflection of democratic will rather than a threat to it. Without representation, the government is not by the people for the people. Executive orders are crucial for representative future in two ways. First, they allow presidents to follow through on campaign promises. Since Congress is hidden from the public eye, lawmakers escape accountability for their inaction. On the contrary, Kenneth Mayer, professor of American politics, explains that presidents make public promises on the campaign trail. Post-election, presidents fulfill them using executive promises in order to build credibility with the American people. For example, Santoro, a professor of sociology at the University of Maryland, observed that while congressional responses to racial discrimination by employers were delayed, administrations beginning with Roosevelt until Johnson enacted a series of executive orders to establish fairer hiring standards. Roosevelt's initial commitment kept public the executive branch's intentions. As a result of these orders, the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission quantified that African-American workforce participation rates rose by 6%, and thus, Robert Lynch, a professor in economics at Washington University, concluded that the poverty rate was cut in half from 18 to 9%, breaking a generational cycle for 12 million families. Second, executive orders catalyze long-term change. Congress is no longer the efficient legislative vehicle it once was. As Tim Paynes of the American University reported in 2025 that our current Congress is the least productive ever, passing only 5 bills in 6 months. This is due to the nature of Congress. Howell furthers that because congressional re-election depends on local districts, representatives prioritize local interests at the expense of the nation. However, it does not have to be this way. During times of crisis, Congress has unified. It now becomes a question of how to sustain the spirit of compromise, as executive orders encourage congressional efficiency in two ways. First, they provide the blueprints for long-term policies, as Maya Wiley, professor of public policy at NYU, confirmed in 2023 that executive orders can offer guidances on the interpretation and application of laws, issuing critical recommendations on policy priorities. Second, executive orders prompt congressional action, as Matthew Dickinson of Harvard confirmed in 2016 that when the president leads the charge, Congress is incentivized to act first to avoid deferring its power. For example, after President Bush led an executive order to establish the Homeland Security Council, it soon was encoded into law. And it's because of these orders that Congress has passed momentous policies. For example, according to professor of history Mark Voss, the Emancipation Proclamation prompted Congress to enact the 13th Amendment, codifying freedom into America's DNA. And consequently, Amy Stanley, a professor of law, confirmed in 2010 that upwards of 50,000 enslaved women and children were freed, heralding a new birth of human rights. Representation is at the core of democracy. Once broken, our system falls apart, as Suzanne Berger, a professor of political science at MIT, explains in 2017 that only when voters feel alienated by their government do they turn to radical populist leaders that undermine our democracy's foundations. Throughout times of inaction, executive orders prove our government still cares about the people's needs. From the desegregation of the military to the creation of FEMA to the New Deal, they are a beacon of light that America is still a country by the people, of the people, for the people. Affirmed.
Like any cards on that. You ready to go? Right?
Yes.
All right. May I ask the first question?
Yes.
Sounds good. Let's start now. So one key executive order that your case mentions is racial desegregation, right?
Yes.
For example, Lyndon B. Johnson's integration of races into the military or the job market. What legal tool did Donald Trump recently use to reverse that exact order?
He used an executive order, but this debate is not nitpicking examples. What this debate should be is about the holistic experimentation of what executive orders have been able to do. Civil rights progress is always difficult because it's shaped by the socio-economic sphere around you. But without executive orders, you would never have the Emancipation Proclamation, and you would never have the desegregation of the military, because many times these bills don't pass easily through Congress. Over the long term, we've seen, as you probably agree, a rise in executive orders, but also a rise in improvement in civil rights.
Can I have a short follow-up?
Sure.
Then let's kind of zoom out of that and consider it holistically,
Okay.
right? So we've got two big lawmaking powers here. We've got the executive at the top, and then we've got 535 elected Congress members. So probably the most monumental laws that signify our civil rights sphere is the Civil Rights Act, right? Which came first, the Civil Rights Act or Lyndon B. Johnson's order?
The Civil Rights Act came first, but we
Right.
argue that a lot of these other policies, for example, the Emancipation Proclamation, as well as consistent efforts by President Roosevelt in order to make it so that people have fair employment standards, these were all situations that made it so that we made progress on civil rights. But may I have a question?
Absolutely.
So you talk about how Congress is probably the solution. So do you know who your local congressman is? What policies he campaigned on?
Yeah, I would say that Congress is absolutely the solution insofar as we've always seen Congress unite in times of crisis to represent our people. My local congresswoman is named Katie Britt. She graduated from the University of Alabama, where I live 15 minutes away from, and I know a lot of people there that are really important and also work with her. So in terms of being involved with your local congressperson, I think that's way easier than speaking to the president. I'm sure probably nobody in this room has ever spoken to President
Do you
Trump.
know which issues she's representing you on?
Yeah, I would say one, she's trying to get better energy efficiency in the state of Alabama. Second, she's trying to improve education in the state of Alabama by collaborating, for example, with Governor Kay Ivey. But all of this to say, I'm just telling you what I know about my local elected officials. The point is that despite their differences, Ad and I will tell you that across history, every time we've had a crisis, people put their differences aside and actually make Congress act faster than executive orders ever have. That's why, for COVID, Congress acted first. For 9/11, Congress acted first. For Pearl Harbor, Congress acted first.
Okay.
Just because executive orders have done some amount of good doesn't mean that the foundation was set more importantly by Congress.
Would you like a question for the last 10 seconds or no?
We have 5 seconds left. So
Okay, sure.
Ray Crossfire. Would you like Fred? No. We'll start that now. We'll stop prep time there. That's 43 seconds to use. We have 2 minutes, 17 seconds left.
Just to clarify, my name is Adonai. I will be giving the first rebuttal on the negative, team 1003. Is anyone not ready? Perfect. In that case, my time starts now. It took Congress 1 day to address Pearl Harbor, 3 days to address 9/11, just 5 days on the Great Recession, and a week on COVID. History shows that Congress can do everything executive orders can do, but better, because they have checks and balances. While the president plays towards the base, as Congress and the courts can do nothing about it, across 5 decades, the courts were found to not check 83% of executive orders, and Congress didn't even choose to look at more than 3%. They tell you that Congress cannot act, but Congress can compromise in times of crises with bigger bills. Their analysis is that Congress is not passing lots of legislation immediately. But let's think about the most recent legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act. All of these are multi-trillion-dollar bills that address a plethora of issues. Instead of passing smaller bills, they're getting more done with less. That's much more efficient. They tell you that cutbacks in staffing make Congress less efficient, but their evidence on congressional capacity is an analysis beginning in the mid-1990s to now, insofar as we properly addressed all of these crises that I've already named and are still passing legislation. It's clear congressional capacity still exists. But with that, let's look at their first argument on campaign promises. There are 2 main responses here. First, on civil rights, putting that much power in one person's hands has led to our darkest moments. Anders of the ACLU explains executive orders were used to send 120,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps during World War II, to strip civil rights protections during the Trump administration, and as Hines adds, to build nuclear weapons and ban Muslim-majority country refugees from entering the United States. I'd like to note, Most of these executive orders had major public support behind them, but just because the mob calls for racism doesn't mean the Constitution should instantly fall. With that, let's also consider the argument of populism here once again. When the president passes these executive orders, sidesteps Congress, that leads to these rush orders which give in to the mob. So if you want to vote on advancing good social change, you need to mitigate populism first. With that, let's take a look at their argument on long-term change. There are going to be 4 responses here. Start on 9/11, there are 2 reasons executive orders weren't key. First, long-term security was guaranteed through congressional policy, not executive orders. The DHS reports it was founded through the Homeland Security Act of 2002 and prevented other tragic attacks by examining 100% of baggage and 14 million passengers every week through what most of us had to go to get here, the TSA. Second off, executive orders make Americans lose trust specifically. Bush secretly used them to let the NSA, a government spy agency, listen in on 1 million calls and texts without a warrant. That makes people feel that safety means giving up their freedom, which pushes public opinion against very necessary checks on national security. But let's look specifically towards the Emancipation Proclamation. They tell you that it was because of executive order that we had this, but we would contest that Congress would have done it anyway because they fought the war to begin with, to bring the South back and to establish a clear policy on slavery. Executive advice to pass a bill would have done it the same way that FDR posed executive advice to pass New Deal legislation. And second, the Library of Congress shows that Lincoln waited to issue the Emancipation Proclamation until Congress acted, proving that even historic executive orders relied on legislative action first, which had checks and balances. And finally, remember that the entire idea of acting to ensure civil rights permanently, to prevent reversals, and to create long-term change requires permanent legislation in Congress. Populism downs it. It's a strong negative element.
Okay, we're going to be taking some prep time soon. That was 36 seconds. Is everyone good? They provide you a list of examples of when Congress acted first, but they do not look at everyday issues that plague Americans, from how to put food on the table, to just economic uncertainty and social unrest, which is why, despite what they say, they have not considered what the average American thinks. What goes conceded out of that speech is that 72% of Americans do not believe currently Congress represents their needs. This is the reason you vote pro, because it means that the only way we push forward as a nation is not to wait until our representatives squabble over issues, but instead to have a president to help lead us towards the right direction. And that's the thesis of our case. Within that in mind, let's address my opponent's arguments proper. They first talked about congressional capacity. That was never our argument. But our argument is specifically on campaigning on promises. They had told you that some promises have been bad, like Japanese internment camps. We agree that these were bad campaign promises. However, these are some examples, and they do not represent the historical spirit of civil rights. Since the beginning of executive orders, we have seen civil rights taking a large trajectory towards a positive moment. Now, with the Emancipation Proclamation, we freed the slaves, we have desegregated the military, we have pushed a pathway for LGBTQ plus individuals to have freedoms. All of this demonstrates to you that even if there are hiccups in the road, we still push forward because the president leads us forward towards that direction. On our second argument about prompting Congress, all the responses about how Congress acted first, that doesn't matter. You can believe this and still comfortably vote pro, because what my opponents have missed is even if a bill is passed, there is no idea of how to enforce it, how to direct it to the people, what an executive order is there to tell the people how Congress is serving them and how we can actually enforce it. Which is why, for example, during COVID-19, it was an executive order that used the funding of a bill to actually mandate vaccines. Finally, talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, but remember, that was the first step to actually tell people that it was important to free the slaves. Even if they tell you that there was a 13th Amendment, if there was no Emancipation Proclamation, you would not have the 13th Amendment. With that in mind, let's go on to my opponent's arguments about checks and balances and political whiplash. The first biggest issue you must ask yourself is what's the state of our democracy? Again, even if it is imperfect, what Kevin Cook, a professor of law, tells you in 2025 is that it is resilient because the way that it has to be constructed was meant to weather the very concerns that my opponents talk about. For example, the reason why our courts work for the past few centuries is because they have life-term tenors and they're bound to the Constitution, not to the loyalties of the president. It is also because of how difficult it is to change the legal system that we have maintained our ability to protect and safeguard the Constitution. That's why after 15,000 executive orders later, we still have a functional democracy, and why all the negative harms that they tell you about, such as cuts to FEMA and jobs, were all overturned by the courts. On the specific argument about policy whiplash, however, here's the broad understanding you must have. Even if Biden and Trump are anomalies, what Kenneth Lowen, a professor of political science, tells you in 2024 is that holistically, only 75% of executive orders are actually reversed. They'll come up here and say that the 25% are still bad and reversed. But remember, as a democracy, that is important that you adapt to the changes of the people. Nothing will ever remain the same, which is why it's important that our government is listening to the people and responds, because one that doesn't is so much worse. On this specific argument about climate, we're going to make the case that even if some executive orders have been bad for climate, for instance, Biden was the one who put insurance back into the Paris Agreement and helped pave the way for the Inflation Reduction Act, which is why they tell you about renewable spending, but they don't tell you what's happening right now. What Mateo 24 tells you is that renewable spending is at an all-time high despite Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. Finally, on the argument about populism, they tell you about polarization, but they don't tell you the true story. There's many countries in democracies with polarization, but they don't have executive orders like France and Sweden. Why? Because of alternative causes. A simplification that saying executive orders cause polarization is ridiculous because the media, campaigning, and funding, all of which consider special interests. That is why it's important that we find a solution, and that's why executive orders guides the way. But secondly, and more importantly, we tell you that the reason why they'll work with Congress is because Congress is important to enforce the acts, which is why Stephen Klass tells you that we always enact modern policies that gain the support of Congress that help with the people.
Okay, are you good for cross?
Yeah.
We'll take prep time before so I can cross actually. Okay. We'll start prep now. Stop prep there, that's a minute 50 seconds used. We have 27 seconds left.
Do you want to sit or sit?
Please.
Is there the first question?
You spoke first, so you can.
Okay. In that case, time starts now. You said in your last speech that all of the harms we listed in case were overturned by the courts. When?
I would say within like a month or so after Trump issued the order.
So when was the court case on FEMA?
Again, it's been a few months within, I can't give you a specific date, but it's been overturned because the courts have checks and balances that show that it was not constitutional. Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Okay. Let's talk about polarization, right?
Yes.
So, when did executive orders start in our country?
George Washington signed
So,
it to
yeah.
declare
So when did
neutrality.
populism and polarization really start taking pace in our system of government?
It started when we saw a massive increase in the use of reversals right after the Obama administration. It's when we started to prioritize immediate action and the people saw a president who could go up on a stage and say, I am the one who will fix all of your problems.
So I'm
It's
really
really reminiscent of everything we've heard in the Biden and Trump administration. That's why Congress gets deprioritized and agencies get cut
I
down.
understand your argument, but here's where I'm confused here. You're saying that for the past 2 centuries that we've had executive orders, there's been no back and forth, but it's only somehow in the 21st century that we started seeing these reversals?
Yes, it's because when you put one bad actor with an abusable tool, you're going to have harm. We've had other short blips of harms, for example, that had huge impacts. Take Japanese internment, the targeting of Muslims after 9/11. All executive orders do is villainize American citizens instead of actually responding to
Japanese
a
internment
crisis.
camps is an example against you because
How?
there was a reversal in policy. FDR was the one who instated it, but Truman was the one who overturned it soon after. Isn't this an example of reversal of policy? So shouldn't your arguments have already triggered?
No, here's the main problem with that. The only reason it was reversed, was not because of Truman, it's because the courts decided to ignore the entire act for 4 years. 4 years, which 120,000 Japanese Americans were stuck in internment camps purely because of their own race. This act is very clearly unconstitutional, a violation of people's rights, and the courts turned a blind eye because, as our evidence says, they are loyal to the president and have been across 5 decades of study. Do you mind if I ask a question?
For sure.
Okay, let's go back to this idea that the courts all overturned it.
Yeah.
So, which case? I'm not quite sure here because FEMA's firings are still continuing up to now, but there was a court case on it in April. How did that court case end?
The district judge, John McConnell, said that it was unconstitutional and said that that shouldn't continue, which is why it's an example of an order being blocked.
And what happened in the Court of Appeals?
I'm sure you can tell me.
The Court of Appeals let it go through anyways because President Trump set a record in implementing his own justices that are loyal to him throughout the entire appellate court. That's why he's won in 10 out of 12 cases.
Again, that is a gross oversimplification of how the process worked. If that was true, all of Trump's orders would be active right now.
Yes.
But again, we have seen an end to his cuts to Inflation Reduction Act and the end to the birthright citizenship.
We'll contest that later, but good cross.
The order of my speech will be an overview of Congress and constitutionality, discussing our negative case and continuing to respond to our opponents' affirmative case. Is anyone not ready?
Give me a moment, please.
No problem.
Thank you. Thank you.
Adonai tells you that it took Congress only 1 day to address Pearl Harbor, 3 days for 9/11, 5 days for the Great Recession, and 1 week for COVID. History shows Congress can do everything orders can do, but better and faster. To these empirics, they only have 2 responses. First, they claim that the courts are resilient and uphold constitutionality, but if the Japanese internment camps literally violated due process, that's a real reason why that doesn't work. That's why when presidents are taken to court, they're still able to win 83% of the time, and that is precisely what's happening with Trump. Second, they say that 75% of orders are not reversed, but think about that. That means 25% of American policy is trashed every time a new president is elected. That testifies to how broken and abusive this system is. America deserves more permanent solutions. At that point, the best place to sign your ballot is our argument on populism, where the power of executive orders has changed the presidency from a position to advance American progress to one that reverses everything the last president has done. that hinders long-term progress on any issue in the name of crushing their predecessors' legacy, that casts Congress to the side, undermines key agencies like FEMA, and brings us dangerously close to the kind of centralized power our founders feared. Their one and only response is that there are alternative causes to polarization, but we would tell you that the US is uniquely polarized. That's why our meta-analysis by the American Enterprise Institute says executive orders are a unique way for people to point fingers. But that doesn't even matter because populism is not the same as polarization. Populism is giving the rash ideas of the public to give that power all to the president. That's why even though Congress, who studied the Constitution, thought Japanese internment was wrong, the people who had racist ideas at the time empowered the president to let that slide through. There is a clear distinction there. That is why the president has currently destroyed our crisis response systems that are crucial to solving for any of the historical crises that the affirmative wants to talk about. But then, let's go to their case where you're much more unsure. First, Adonai tells you that quantity doesn't mean quality. Just because the number of laws passed by Congress is decreasing doesn't mean they're gridlocked. They're compromising when they need to during crises, but more importantly, passing big bills, like the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. But second, they miss our litany of responses, like the Japanese internment camps and banning Muslims during World War II. Their only response is that executive orders have been key for good civil rights acts, but insofar as the system shouldn't have even allowed 120,000 to be incarcerated, we're not talking about good or bad examples, we're talking about this broken system that allows abuse to happen. Finally, on the Emancipation Proclamation, insofar as Lincoln literally waited for Congress to act before he passed it, this shows that the president is always trailing behind Congress, not taking the leap forward. You know, if you want to vote for a representative democracy, the real power lies in Congress and not in executive orders.
Okay, we're going to take some prep time starting now.
So I was going to start on an overview with my case and go to their case. Are just an appendix ready? This debate is about representation, because without representation, you cannot make a government by the people, for the people. You cannot pass the policies that are necessary to assure Americans employment, housing, economic prosperity, etc. But the problem today is that we are no longer seeking an ideal government. We are just seeking a functioning democracy. And here is the biggest problem of your debate. Congress right now is heavily polarized. They may make all of these arguments saying that it's because of executive orders, but that ignores so many different factors, from the fact that lobbyists are in Congress with their own special interests, the fact that congressmen are trying to address their own specific geographic issues. Someone from Iowa isn't going to agree with somebody from Texas. These issues make it so that structurally Congress cannot pass policies, and even if they argue that they're passing bigger policies, it's only 5 policies in 6 months. And again, ask yourself, which policies do you know of these 5 policies? If it's nothing, you know that Congress is not representative, which is why Pew Research concludes that 72% of Americans no longer believe in it. Here's the crux of the issue. Our argument is the prior question to theirs, because so far as 72% of the people don't believe in Congress and the representation, they are going to be more inclined to vote for populist leaders to vest power in the presidency, and they are more inclined to exacerbate all the harmful impacts that they talk about. Thus, our argument is that executive orders are imperfect, but they are the solution we need, and that is our first argument of campaign promises. It's very simple. Because Congress is behind closed doors and people aren't aware of the policies, as well as because it's polarized, people aren't looking there. They look to presidents who want to build their legacy using their campaign promises and executive orders. That's important because we've been able to spearhead immense change from the Emancipation Proclamation to Roosevelt's Fair Employment, which has lifted poverty by 50% and freed 12 million families from generational poverty. They isolate a few examples of Japanese American internment camps, and obviously these are bad things. We do not refute that, but when holistically you look at the long term and you realize that at the end of the day, civil rights has improved, women can vote, etc., and that these executive orders have a critical point of change, you know that you have to look to them in the first place. But finally, they just see that Lincoln waited for legislative action. That definitely demonstrates one thing, that executive orders and Congress work in tandem, and that we're able to enforce the laws that Congress passes. When there's nobody to enforce the laws in the first place, even if you have a law, it does not matter. But now let's go to their argument on populism specifically. There are a lot of problems. First, you have to remember that Congress can make the law, but when it's polarized, it's not making enough laws, and secondly, it's not going to be able to enforce the law. For example, the reason why executive orders are important is in like COVID-19, when what we saw was that Congress passed funding, but executive orders were able to enforce this funding by making mask mandates, etc., saving millions of lives. But secondly, what our past evidence says, and it's completely conceded, is that presidents are always going to do moderate policy so that Congress would fund their executive orders in the first place. That's important, because out of these policies we've seen Social Security, the Department of Homeland Security, etc., all of which are the benefits that have led to American democracy today. Thank you.
Great speech, Esther.
Okay, thank you. Great speech.
Ready for Grant?
Yes.
Y'all want to sit for this one?
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Do you want the first question?
Y'all spoke first, so you get the courtesy of the first question.
Awesome. You can take it.
Okay. So you try to highlight that only moderate executive orders are passed, so Congress can fund them.
Yeah.
Are Trump's executive orders moderate?
Again, moderate as in from a holistic viewpoint. You can come up here and list a few examples that have been exceptions to the rule, but we're telling you what historically the rule has been, right? Even if Trump says, hey, or even if Trump is the one example of that extreme policy, every other president has followed a track of moderacy because the only way they know that they can represent the needs of the people, but also ensure that the government is functioning as it should have been, designed by the Founding Fathers, is through
Again, I think we need to zoom out here. One, we've given you a litany of examples of executive orders that were oppositely bad, but when you zoom out, we're talking about the system, not the orders themselves. The system that even allowed for these atrocities to exist in the first place is what the negative is critiquing, not the fact that bad orders exist.
While we're the evidence isolates is that the majority of executive orders represent the people regardless of whether you disagree with it or
Is this
not.
the
Do
seven
you
or
think
wait, hold on.
representation is a bad thing?
Representation is a bad thing when it violates the fundamental rights of the people.
And let me ask
A government that's for the people, by the people, for the sake of oppressing others is not a
And
democracy.
really quickly, let me ask you a follow-up question. What has happened to all those bad executive orders? They've either been overturned, followed with better policy that actually reverses the harms. For instance, Reagan issued an executive order to actually give reparations back to the Japanese. We acknowledge there have been bad executive orders, but you must understand that progress is possible only in a world where we have effective governments, and that comes if a leader of a president can help guide that to the nation.
I know, but what Adonai was telling you in his rebuttal is that even though they are overturned eventually, it takes months for the courts to check back. A good analogy is just because a firefighter comes to put a fire out doesn't mean that people were burned in the disaster. It's the same logic we're going for.
But
Japanese internment, yes, was overturned, it took months. And in that time, people had their fundamental rights violated.
But I think
If you let me finish,
yeah.
what we're saying is that even that short amount of time, and a lot of times it's not short, it's actually months and years that people are violated, is something that's unacceptable in our government system and something that shouldn't be allowed. We're not trying to point fingers at Republican or Democrat presidents, we're pointing fingers at the tool that is empowering them to
But
commit
here's
atrocities.
the problem. You're trying to search for a government that's perfect. No government ever is. If we're obsessing over a perfect government, we will never actually be able to evaluate this resolution correctly. We will acknowledge that there have been bad consequences, but you only list examples. You've not given a broader reason as to why these examples demonstrate a structural issue with the government. We're the only ones that have, because we don't just look at the examples. We look at the explanations of what it's been.
We're not just looking at the examples, we're looking at a trend here. A tool that can just cut straight through the courts, straight through Congress, and lets a president do whatever they want is the perfect tool for abuse. You can come up here and tell us that we're just picking certain examples, but it's a continuous trend of abuse.
Great cross. We have 27 seconds left, so start that now. That's all of us at times.
Is anyone not ready? In that case, this is the first final focus. My name is Adonai, team 1003. It's going to be our case therapies. As Nathan and I have told you time and time again, Congress can do everything executive orders can do, but much better because checks and balances exist. Look towards the litany of crises that we've named throughout this round. Pearl Harbor, 9/11, the 08 recession, COVID. Congress was able to pass legislation without actively violating the civil rights of Americans and villainizing them purely for their existence. You need to remember that in 83% of cases, presidents get away scot-free through court. Even if it's reversed later, the damage is done, and it's not a one-off instance. Look towards the litany of examples we've named throughout this round. It's the Muslim ban, Japanese internment, continuous segregation. If it were just one, I would be happy to just say that the government has corrected itself. But it's a continuous trend of letting abusive policy be passed by horrible leaders. That's a problem with the tool, not just an example. At that point, let's look towards the effectiveness of Congress. They tell you that lobbying and geographic preferences, alongside other factors, slow down Congress. But insofar as they're still passing major legislation like I named, such as the Inflation Reduction Act and other climate policy, and they are actively responding to crises, Congress is much more effective. But let's look towards the mistake of executive orders, specifically on populism. We tell you that the power of executive orders has changed the presidency from a position to advance progress to one of reversing all policy that hinders long-term progress, crushing the predecessor's legacy, and cutting down at Congress's role in the democracy. What that means is that regardless of alternative causes of polarization, Congress's ability to pass legislation, the executive deprioritizes the way our government works. This isn't a matter of looking for the perfect government, it's a matter of maintaining the one we have. Let's look towards their case. They concede that Congress would have done the Emancipation Proclamation. They brought the teeth to the civil rights action that saved millions. At that point, take their argument at the highest ground. There is no impact behind their case. We're preventing the suffering of millions in a continuous trend of violation. It's a strong negative ballot.
We have 40 seconds left, right? So that's turn now. obsession with perfection is what will bring our government down. Because there is no government that is perfect. There will always be issues and hiccups along the way. But what is important is that we have a government that can still operate for the people. Which is why, while my opponents only mention national emergencies, they have not considered the everyday crises that everyone faces. How to put food on the table, immigration, healthcare. Which is why they don't tell you what the average American person thinks, but we do. 72% of Americans do not believe that Congress represents them. If this is correct and you still want to vote for their system, sure, but we're the ones saying that we should look for a system that actually works, which is why they actually answer for you, why you should vote pro. They say that you want to maintain the government we have that is the one with executive orders, and here's exactly why. That is because of campaign promises. A president must be elected by their people, which is why, for instance, they will uphold the representativeness that they do, which is why every single time they go into office, they pass policies that are important for the people, and when the people feel represented, here's why that matters. If they don't feel represented, you'll feel alienated, which is why you'll actually vote for more populist leaders in the long term. That you should ask yourself this question: why, after 15,000 executive orders, do we still have a democracy? It is because representation has been the one that has allowed us to still believe in the government we have today. They have listed you a bunch of examples of when executive orders have done tremendous harm. We agree that these were harmful executive orders, but what they don't tell you is that it's just system of government. Congress has also passed terrible acts. They're the ones that passed discrimination acts and whatnot. But that doesn't mean that we should stop believing in our government, because what's happened in the past 50 years is that civil rights has turned to have increased beneficialness, because women have now the ability to vote. There's no more slaves, and there's a lot more rights that they don't tell you about, because our system of government still represents the people. But here's what you need to remember on their aisle to flow, because if you do vote for them, you will have no policy. What my opponents don't understand is that it's not a system between either the executive, between the president or Congress. We must work together, which is why the president will not just pass random policies. They will find a way where Congress actually meets them in the middle, which is why representation only improves in a row with executive orders. So a vote for us is a vote for more representative government. You affirm.
Great round.